begin. Hi, my name is Renee Hobbs, and it's Wednesday, April 11th. I'm here with the amazing students of EDC 534. On tonight's call, I see Denise, Barbara, Cricket, Meg, Pat Smith-Johnson, and Sherry Jackson is joining us by voice. And, obviously our topic is transformativeness. So those of you who are watching the recording, it's probably useful for you to know that I'm here in Washington, D.C. I just spent the day at the Library of Congress at the United States Copyright Office. So feel very tired, actually, and a little bit tired of doing this. I have been petitioning the Copyright Office for since 2009, so that's almost 10 years now. And sometimes I win and sometimes I lose, but it's feeling like I can't imagine having to do this for the rest of my life. And maybe someday this process won't be needed, and maybe, don't just between us, maybe it isn't even needed now. But in 1998, Congress wrote a law called the Digital Millennium Copyright Law. It criminalized the act of ripping a DVD, and it also protected the platform companies like Google and YouTube from copyright liability, provided that they automatically take down any content that they suspected was infringing. And when Congress wrote that law, they knew that the criminalizing of DVD ripping, they knew that was violating both the First Amendment and the Section 107 of the copyright law. They knew that. So they wrote in a provision that said there might be some circumstances where people need to make fair use of movies, copy-protected movies. And if those people need an exemption every 3 years, they can come to the Copyright Office and ask for one. And the first guy in line, Peter DeCherney from the University of Pennsylvania, he said, well, college film professors need to be able to rip film DVDs to show clips of films in classes. He got the exemption. And I was like, oh, that's cool, but why just film professors? And why not elementary and secondary teachers? They need to do that too. And so I came back in 2009 and asked for an exemption for K-12 teachers, and they said no. They said no. Teachers can't handle it. And the outrage in the legal community was so robust. There was like a Harvard Law Review article written about it and everything. And the next time I came back to the Copyright Office and said, now why can't K-12 teachers? And I showed a whole bunch of examples of teachers who wanted to be able to do that. Media literacy teachers, right? And so they granted the exemption. And then when I went back the last time, I asked for the exemption to be expanded to students, and was not granted the student exemption. But it was put into the law that students who needed to use clips of copyrighted movies could use screencasts, could make a screencast. And you guys have had some experience with that, making screencasts. So that kind of got clearly established as a legal practice, making a screencast clip to incorporate in your other creative work. That was great. This year, we had the formidable opposition. On the other side of the table was the Motion Picture Association of America and the Recording Industry of America and the Video Game Manufacturers of America, and they were all shooting us down. It was me, the guy from Brigham Young University, the guy from American University, and the guy representing the American Library Association. So we did the best we could. The questions were tough, and I hope it works out. We'll see. What they're thinking about doing, they say to us, is they're thinking right now there's 7 separate exemptions. There's one for K-12 teachers. There's one for K-12 students. There's one for college teachers. There's one for film college teachers. And, and then there's one for educators who are working in nonprofit settings like libraries, museums, and other nonprofit organizations. And they're thinking about lumping all of those into one great, big, beautiful exemption. Of course, these days, how many of us even have a DVD recorder? How often do we rip DVDs or even know how to do it, right? So in some ways, streaming video and the rise of YouTube digital culture is kind of obviating the need for DVD ripping. And I wonder if I'll need to be coming back for, my whole life. But there's a really interesting paradox that's driving me crazy. And I'll just, I'm dumping all my troubles on your doorstep here, even before we start talking, right? And that has to do with Netflix, right? You could imagine, right, that media literacy teachers might want to use Netflix in their teaching, right? Have you ever encountered a show on Netflix, a film or a movie that you thought might be cool to bring into the classroom or to link to something in the classroom? Give me a thumbs up if you've ever seen a Netflix video that you might have thought could make good use of for the classroom. Right. But guess what? You can't do it. You can't legally bring a Netflix screen into your classroom. Okay? So here's how it works. So under Section 110A of the copyright law, you can use any lawfully acquired audiovisual material for educational purposes. So according to the Copyright Act of 1976, you can use Netflix. You can use an excerpt, you can use a scene, you can even screen the whole film. That's what the law mandates under Section 110, the face-to-face exception. It says you can bring in any lawfully acquired audiovisual material and use it for educational purposes. So copyright law allows you to use Netflix. But the terms of service agreement that you signed with Netflix when you had your subscription says you can only use Netflix in your home. So if you want to use Netflix in your classroom, you have to violate the terms of service agreement, which you can do, but you're doing it. And so we brought that up with the Copyright Office and said, this is not good. And guess what? Netflix will not deal with academic libraries or school libraries to get a library subscription or a school district subscription. So it's like we're in between a rock and a hard place when it comes to Netflix. We can't use our personal account, and they won't sell us a institutional subscription. Okay, so if you ask me, that's like a control mechanism that's really kind of dangerous. We can't critically analyze films that we access on Netflix, right? It just seems crazy. Adam.
Well, I have a question about that. Like, what would be, is there like a defined amount of people that constitute an audience? Like, if I watch Netflix with a friend, we're both watching the same thing. What's the difference if it's me and 22 friends in a classroom?
Yeah. So what's the definition of a group viewing, right? If you have to read the terms of service agreement pretty closely, and it says something like, if you're in the dorm room with 3 to 5 friends, that's personal use. But if you're in a classroom with 22 to 25 students, that's not home use. So they have it written in a very clear way that says classroom use is not included in the terms of service. So it's a really fascinating, the whole topic of copyright and fair use is something that definitely should blow your mind. But now, rather than blather on about it all night long, let's like take a look at what we're supposed to be focusing on, because actually tonight I'm hoping that you're going to share some of the ahas you got from reading and thinking about transformativeness. So let's go to the agenda for tonight. I've kind of shared with you my story. We won't find out for about another year what the Copyright Office determines. They do these hearings here in Washington, then they go do the hearings out in Los Angeles, and in about 9 months or so, we'll know what their determination is. But our focus question for tonight: how do digital authors build upon and advance knowledge by using the creative works of others? Okay, I've told you about my testimony. Now, here we go. Let's play a small group discussion, shall we? This is way too many questions, but let's take a look at the questions, and then we're going to break up into small groups. I'm going to ask you to work with a partner or in a group of 3 to choose 2 of the questions on this list to discuss with your partner. What's the purpose of copyright? Why is the doctrine of fair use such an important part of copyright law? What kinds of misunderstandings do educators have about copyright and fair use in relation to digital learning? How did educational use guidelines, charts, and checklists develop, and what consequences did they have for teachers and librarians? What is the code of best practices in fair use for media literacy education, and how is it different from the guidelines? Why does the legal use of copyrighted material need to be assessed on a case-by-case basis? Why is parody protected by copyright law? Why is remix protected? And what are the limits of these protections? What is digital rights management, and why is it controversial? What are 3 visions for the future of copyright, and which one resonates most with you? And number 10, what's the one thing you wish everyone knew about how copyright law relates? Now, I'm going to invite you to join a small group. You're going to choose 2 questions, and your partners are going to choose 2 questions, and you will start discussing and answering these questions. Really, this is an everybody learns from everybody, and it's about how do you synthesize what you learned and read into a crisp answer, because people are going to be looking to you to be an authority on this topic as you step into your role as a digital literacy leader. So we're going to take about 15 minutes for this. Give me a thumbs up if you know what we're doing next. Okay, got it. I'm just checking all the thumbs. Keep the thumbs up if you're there. I see some new folks. Hi, Angie. Hi, Matt. Okay, so let's break you up into groups. We'll take about 12 to 15 minutes, and then we'll come back as a large group and see what we've learned. Okay, so let's see here. I think that should do it. Let's see what happens. You should be getting a signal now to move into the breakout rooms. We'll meet back here in about 12 minutes.
Video, he used images from Star Wars to explain what a remix was. So he changed the content enough that it's his own original work, even though it uses blatantly the work of someone else. So fair use exists to protect, and you only so if someone were to say, hey, you used my work, fair, you just should be knowledgeable about it. So you can say, no, this is fair use because I remixed it. Like, how is it I guess is it like an esoteric thing that you just should know about?
Oh, this is great. Okay, got it. So fair use is part of copyright law. Okay, it's section 107 of the Copyright Act of 1976. to claim fair use, you don't have to fill out any paperwork.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to sign any forms.
Yeah.
You simply make a fair use determination. You weigh your use of the work against the original purpose. You apply the 4 factors.
Mm-hmm.
You should ask yourself 3 questions. Am I using just the amount I need? Am I using it in a way that's different from the original purpose? Could my use of the work be a market substitution?
Mm.
If your answer is if you answer those questions the right way, then you just make fair use. You don't have to pay. You don't have to ask permission. You just use the work. Do you know what I learned today in the copyright office? It blew my mind. You know these film that came out a couple years ago called Steve Jobs, about the life of the founder of Apple. The filmmaker who made that film wanted to include a scene of his famous 1984 ad called 1984, which was this woman swinging a sledgehammer and breaking through the corporate blah, 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 breaking through the PC dominance with the novel computer. The Apple company, Steve Jobs owns the copyright to that ad, and the Jobs family wouldn't let the filmmaker buy a license for that commercial. So they used it anyway, without payment or permission, claiming fair use, right? So even if you ask permission and you're denied permission, you can still claim fair use, right? So the idea is, are you using it in a way that's different than the purpose originally intended? The original purpose of the 1984 ad was to sell Apple computers. As that clip was used in the documentary film, or docudrama, I guess it probably was, it was used for a different purpose, right? And so it made a very clear claim of fair use. All right, let's see who's next. What question can you answer from this list?
Matt and I talked about quite a few of these things, but one of them that caught my eye was, what is number 5? What is the code of best practices in fair use for media literacy education, and how is it different from guidelines? I'm not sure how it's different from guidelines, but it seemed that it might be helpful to have, kind of like Matt had said about a foundation or a framework. If educators knew what the framework was, best practices, then they might be set free to use more than they are doing if they don't know, which is also a little bit of number 3. What kinds of misunderstandings do they have? If they don't know, they may just not use things. If they do know, then okay, I can do that, or I can use this. So, but I looked at it more as a, like it says, best practices with your intent. Is your intent to, make money off of somebody else's intellectual property, or is it to, use it in an appropriate way that would be educational, or changing it, or whatever?
Yeah, very nice. And Barbara, I'm especially pleased to see how you see the connection between questions 3, 4, and 5. What kind of misunderstandings do educators have about copyright and fair use? Well, they think there's something called a 10% rule. They think you can only use 20 seconds or 30 seconds. And those are all misunderstandings. Mm-hmm. They think they can use anything as long as they cite their sources. That's a terrible misunderstanding. That shows a misunderstanding between plagiarism and copyright, which are 2 different things altogether. So there's a lot of different misunderstandings. One set of misunderstandings came from the educational use guidelines which were created in the 1970s as a negotiated agreement between the educational publishers and some education groups. So those educational use guidelines, charts, and checklists, they developed as a result of lawyers versus lawyers, hammering out what they thought were the sort of absolute certainties of the law. So they were well-meaning attempts, right? The 10% law, the brevity, the spontaneous, all those guidelines were created by lawyers. But unfortunately, they created more misunderstanding. Those guidelines actually confused teachers who thought that the guidelines were the law, right? And the guidelines are not the law. In fact, judges have said for the last 40 years, you can't use those guidelines in any legal proceeding. They have no legal merit. They have no legal weight. They're not the law. So when the guidelines actually turned out to interfere with teachers' understandings of the law, then another group got together, Pat Ofterheide, Peter Yazzie, and myself, and we said, well, let's get educators together and ask them to reason out what do they think fair use means to their use community. Because the doctrine of fair use is meant to be situational and contextual. So poets will make fair use of copyrighted content different from dance educators, and academic librarians will make different use of fair use than kindergarten teachers. And so over the last 15 years, different creative communities that use filmmakers, right? And online video creators. And today at the meeting were vidders and fan fiction people, right? Each use community reasons through what counts as fair use in their community to create these codes of best practice. And one of the reasons why they're different from the educational use guidelines is that the educational use guidelines were hammered out between lawyers in an adversarial way, whereas the code of best practices were created by creative people in the use communities themselves, right? With legal vetting from copyright experts, but without without the stance, the litigious stance that often creates like false tensions between authors and users. So one of the things that we think makes the code of best practices slightly stronger is that when a copyright case comes before a judge, the judge, as part of the legal process, has to ask the creative community involved, well, what are your normative practices in your community? What are the ways your creative community handles the fair use of copyrighted material? And so if a community has those practices, those normative practices written down somewhere, that actually can be really helpful. And in the case of filmmakers, of course, it's been very helpful. Lots and lots of films now use copyrighted material embedded in them that didn't happen 10 years ago. Because the community didn't have such a clear understanding of the law, and now they really do. Okay, so listen, we haven't quite gotten through all of the questions, but we've gotten through some of the most important ones. Why does the legal use of copyrighted material need to be assessed on a case-by-case basis? And this is really important because people are going to come to you for expertise and they're going to expect you to know the answer. So when they say, is it legal for me to blah, 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 blah? You are not an attorney. You are not a lawyer, and you are not the copyright police. So the responsibility that you have is to ask questions back to them. What's the nature of the copyright material that you're using? What was its original purpose? How are you using it? Are you using just the amount you need? Could your use of the work be a substitute for the original? those kinds of questions are going to help the individual make their own fair use determination. And we're really excited about our new book, the Routledge Companion for Media Education, Copyright, and Fair Use, because they're a great article, and I'm going to put it up as an ancillary reading for the very end of the semester. It's an essay called I Got It From Google, and it's about teaching copyright and fair use to elementary children, right? And how those 4 questions that I just suggested to you, they have a lot of relevance, even looking at little children's use of copyrighted material when they're engaged in digital learning. Now, that being said, we can't end the session without 2 things. First, Meg, you totally blew all of our minds with your pedagogical insight on the relationship between the topics that we were learning about, thinking about copyright and fair use in relation to digital authorship and larger pedagogical issues. And can you share a little bit of that insight with our team?
Were you talking to me? Because it cut out. Okay. My Wi-Fi kind of cuts out now and then. Well, I shared this in the small group as well, that as I was reading, and I kind of took more of a metacognitive look at the readings, I recognized that what we do in the classroom, just everyday practices and the language we're using towards do your own work. It was your quote from the book that really stuck out to me, of do your own work. We are, without explicitly doing it, we're really almost implicitly implying that there is this thing of the lone author, and that creation comes from one person, when we know that's not the creative process. And so just by our teaching practices that we've brought through the years because of tradition, we're harming our own understanding and ability to use fair use, because we're creating this mindset in children and youth that they have to work on their own, which implies that media and products are created by one person when everything's a remix.
You know, when I was deeply indoctrinated in this idea of the lone author as an English literature major, and it's taken years to undo it. And now I really get this idea. It's what we talk about in the Summer Institute. Everyone learns from everyone. We're all building upon and interpreting and sharing and reworking and constructing together, whether we want to admit it or not. So I thought that was a really great reflection, Meg. I'm really glad you shared it. It definitely is a dimension of this concept of digital authorship. At least in 2 ways, you should feel empowered. As digital authors and as teachers of digital authorship, you should be empowered to use copyrighted content in your own creative work. If you can answer those 4 questions, you can claim fair use. And your students can as well. And fair use isn't just for non-commercial or educational work. Fair use is something every citizen gets, including for-profit creators, right, who depend on fair use for their own creative work. So don't confuse it by thinking, oh, this is just for education. Fair use applies to all aspects of creative work in a lot of different contexts, from architecture and engineering to lots of other fields as well. But it's a tradition, at least in my class, when we talk about copyright and fair use, to have a sing-along. And so now, I would like you to get out your lyric sheet, because we're going to have a sing-along. We don't get to do sing-alongs very often in this class, but tonight is a sing-along night. So just let's see if I can help you find it. Down at the bottom here, you're going to see, let's have a sing-along. So click open that lyric sheet. Okay. And if you're like me, you probably want to download that so you have that in some other place, so it's not on your open browser. So I'm downloading it to my download. Let me see if I can download it now. I'm saving it to my download. Okay, there it is. Ooh, boy, now I've got it. And now.
If anybody wants it in paper copy, it's in our book, page 79.
Bravo! Love it, love it, love it. Or just go to 79. You got it. Now, this only works if you unmute your microphone and you sing aloud loudly. And being in tune or in key is kind of irrelevant. It's just more the pleasure of singing along. Okay, now give me a thumbs up if you understand what we're going to be doing. I'm going to hit play on the YouTube video. You're going to follow along with your lyric sheet, and we're just going to sing loudly and off key, right? And remember to open up your microphone, because we're supposed to hear everybody all together now, right? All together now. All right, let me see if I can get this party started. All right, there we go. This is probably the best thing I've ever made in my whole life right here, so I'm so proud of it. Section 107 of the copyright tells us that we can no permission.
Copyright material without permission or paying license fee. When it costs copyright holder, the benefit society.
Fair use as many ways.
Context situation, determine how fair use applies. Situation determines how fair use applies.
Copyrighted material without permission, pay a license fee. When the cost to the copyright holder is less than the benefits. How will I know if you applies to my situation? You must think through these 4 factors. Nature of the purpose of the use, the amount of use, and the effect on the market.
Purpose. Repurpose.
Copyrighted material without permission or paying a license fee. When the cost of copyright holder
Benefits for society. Good work.
Did I?
Practice now. I repurpose. Did I add value? Repurpose. It was created. It was fair use. Did I add value? The copyright holder is less society.
You guys rock! Let's give ourselves a round of applause! Oh my God, that was wonderful. Thank you guys so much for indulging me in the group sing-along. There's, of course, you know, sing-along in person is really fun, but it can be fun online too. All right. Thank you so much. All right, we have just 2 minutes remaining, and take a look what I'm going to keep the line open if you want to talk about your final project tonight, even after the call is over. next week, you're submitting a scope of work plan. So you're creating some of these intermediate documents that help me see that you're moving through your process. Email that to me as send me a informal document on that. That's all I need. I thought it would be good for you to start taking a look at a pachakacha. First things first, let's pronounce it correctly. Never say it the other way. It's not a pecha kucha. It's a pachakacha. And that's how you know you went to grad school. Pachakacha. And please watch this. It's just a 5-minute video. It's a pachakacha on presenting a pachakacha. Now, is that not meta or what?
That's meta.
That's so meta. And that 5 minutes is going to give you a lot of insights on your own pachakacha, right? Okay, and so watch the pachakacha, work on your final project. If you guys have any questions, I'll hang here and chat with you. Otherwise, you know, get working. The end of the semester is coming and you're brewing something really cool for your final project in digital authorship, right? All right, thanks a lot. I'll see you guys next week.
Have a good night.
Good night.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Sure.